not bystanders to history, but most of us do not keep journals, may not even recognize that history is happening in front of us. There are a few special people who do keep journals, recognize the history that is in front of them, the history they may even be making. Ken Ashworth is one of those. In his book, Stories Better Not Told, Reflections from a Lifetime, he recounts the history he has seen and lived. This afternoon, he and Katherine McGhee share their conversation about the history Ken has written and describe the challenges that writing a personal history present. Imagine you are sitting on a restaurant patio and you notice two people engaged in conversation and you wish you could hear what they are saying. This afternoon, you do not have to worry about being impolite. I welcome you to overhear the conversation between Ken and Katherine as they discuss the making of stories better not told, reflections from a lifetime.
Thank you. It's so good to see everyone here this afternoon. I have had the pleasure of reading Ken's newest book, just published on Amazon. I'm assuming you did not pick the April 1st release date, right? So I have many questions for you. I'm interested in the genesis of the book and the process and some of the mechanics, and I'm really interested in the characters you introduced me to in this book. Okay, thank you. Sorry, I'm interested in hearing all sorts of things about how the book happened and about the characters you introduced. So the title, why stories that are not told?
Well, let me thank Lori and Katherine, for willing to participate in this with me. Well, I'll address this question of the title first. You need a hook to get the. Now, let me give you another title. Suppose I'd said, My Precious Stories You Need to Read. Would that be a hook? Or someone, younger person, suggested I should consider OMG, Funny Stories, LOL. Well, that's not the audience I'm trying to reach. That understands what OMG stands for. The process, I became interested in writing down stories because of a mentor that I met in Washington, D.C., named Louis Brownlow. He was in his 80s when I met him, and I was in my 20s. He had been appointed Commissioner of the District of Columbia by Woodrow Wilson, and he had known every president since Grover Cleveland. And Kennedy was president, had just been elected president when I ran into him on the streets there. And he had written a book called The Anatomy of an Anecdote, and he had written down stories, and maybe he served as a model for me, but I just started writing down stories, particularly stories that I felt would be lost if I didn't write them down. At the time I was putting them together, Katherine, I didn't think I'd ever publish anything, but these were stories that I wanted to keep to refresh myself. And then I got here and had some spare time and started to pick up other stories. There's some stories I picked up here that I can't use, and I did. One of them is about I heard about this elderly gentleman had moved in here some years ago who kept his house, which he called his pad. and he would have monthly what were called Viagra parties. I didn't think I wanted to reveal that in a book to the general public about Westminster. And they're still coming in. Andy Reeves, our neighbor, was talking one night about how cold it was in Germany when she and her husband were located there, and it was so hard to get warm, even when you went to bed. And I commented on that, and she said, oh, but I had a friend who said that England was worse than Germany. She and her husband were in northern England, and she said the only way they could get warm at night was to go to bed in her husband's flight suits. And then she commented later, you know, with all those zippers between the two of us, I can't understand how I got pregnant. So that gives you an example of the kinds of stories I've picked up and included in this book. And I guess I've commented on the process as well.
Yes, and reminded us to be a little careful about the stories we tell. I know you have a fantastic memory, but it amazes me the detail you recall, and you didn't take notes on these things, right? A lot of it is just memory.
Memory of the setting. I have the ability to recall how things really happened, how things were said. And I will not deny that there might be a little embellishment here and there. That's the proper word. But that's...
Well, they're intriguing stories, and reflect an interesting life that you have lived. I think that it's been said that at the end of the day, what we have is our stories, and our stories speak to who we are. So I think that this book in some ways tells us who you are through the stories that you shared from that life. So do you think of it as something of a memoir?
Well, someone commented to me, who would have thought a book of stories could be a memoir? Who would think that a memoir could be a book of stories? I didn't write this to intend to have some kind of a thread of my life, but I went back to childhood stories, stories that my great uncle told me, stories about early development, and particularly the time I spent in the Navy. Some of those stories are pretty, well, I won't use them.
I enjoy the Navy stories because I've heard you tell a few stories since I moved here, but I've never had heard stories about your adventures in the Navy as a band member in the Navy. I thought those were really interesting. You've also brushed shoulders, if you will, with some really notable people. So I'd like to ask you for sort of quick takes on some of those. Some of them are Texas politicians that those of us who have lived here a long time are familiar with. Others are just generally well-known people. Lady Bird Johnson, you had dealings with her. What was your impressions of her personality, her?
Well, the setting for knowing Lady Bird Johnson was she was appointed to the Board of Regents for the University of Texas, and I happened to be filling a position called Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs. She was chairman of she was made chairman of the Academic Affairs Committee. Joe Kilgore had just left that position, or was leaving that position when we briefed her on her taking over. It turned out that the morning that we were briefing him in the LBJ library, that I had commented as Joe Kilgore and I walked in, I said, you know, they're playing LBJ's voice out there explaining the, what's that room called? The president's room
Oval
Office. He was explaining the Oval Office, and I commented to Joe, you know, he's had two heart attacks already, and her appointment is for 6 years. I think, consider it unlikely that he will survive. And Joe Kilgore said, well, I've had the same thought. While we were talking, he died. At the end of our discussion, her secretary came in and called her out, and she left abruptly. And she had just gotten word that he was on his way to the Brooks Army Hospital in San Antonio, that he had his third and final heart attack. But she was a wonderful person to work for. Some of us wondered if she would continue. Well, she did continue, and she made a major contribution, being one of the first women appointed to the Board of Regents at UT. She may have been the first.
George W. Bush, you have a great Bernanke White Sox story. Who told you that story, Ken? And can you share that?
Well, David Kendrick, who just passed away about a month ago, told me that story. When George Bush was in the White House, Bernanke was working as a lower staff person in banking and finance areas. And one morning he was meeting with the president, and after the meeting broke up, Bush said to him, I noticed that you're wearing white socks. You know, here in Washington, hardly anybody wears white socks. Everybody wears dark socks. So Bernanke, when he came out of the president's office, went down the hall to Cheney's office, and the next day, when he had another meeting with the president, 3 people showed up with white socks. No word was said about anybody's socks, but there were a host of highly qualified and well-recommended specialists in finance banking. But Bush chose Bernanke, and you have to ask yourself, was this because he fit Bush's quirky personality?
Now you said, you mentioned that you characterized Bush as having a quirky sense of humor. Or did you have other experiences of that?
Well, not specifically. I retired from my job while he was governor, and then he went to the White House. But of course, he had this habit of coming up with silly nicknames for people that he was close to. That was one of the quirks. But he played practical jokes on people. Just quirky.
And when you're president, I guess you can do that. Who's going to object, right?
Right.
Preston Smith. Preston Smith was the Texas governor in the early 70s, 69 to 73, I think. And my impression from reading your stories is that you respected and thought highly of it, which leads me to my question. Of all the many politicians you've worked with through the years, which are the ones you most respected and why?
Well, I think I'll just mention 2. Wilhelmina Delco, African-American representative from Austin, was one of the best and soundest politicians that I ever worked with. She had the courage. I don't know if she would have ever charged a machine gun test, but I'll tell you, she had the courage to look up. As one day I was walking with her, and a colleague came up and said, Mrs. Delco, I was just wondering when you're going to hear my bill. And she looked him in the eye and she said, that's a bad old bill, and it's never going to be heard, but I'll hear it if you want to hear it. If you insist on our committee hearing it, I'm going to send it to a subcommittee that I'm going to appoint, and it will never come out of that subcommittee. That was the kind of person she was. Carl Parker, people would be really surprised that I mentioned Carl Parker, because he was after me for years and years. I remember I learned very early that you do not mess with some legislator's bill without talking to him first. So I went to his office, told him what was wrong with the bad old bill he was carrying, and he sat there and glared at me the whole time, and then he said, "I don't know why I'm even bothering listening to you. I'm going to get you fired this session." On another session, he was shaking his fist at me in the Senate chamber and bumping me with his belly and shaking his fist and yelling at me. And Larry Temple was my chairman, my board. And Larry said, "Carl, we went to law school together. What are you doing with Ken? I know you're not going to hit him. Why do you act this way?" Carl was kind of contrite and said, "Because it works so well." But Carl was a really solid, forward-looking progressive politician. He carried good politician, good bills, and had a sound judgment. I would list those two if I had to pick two. Of course, one of them's sitting over here.
Our friend Max Sherman.
Max Sherman and I, the first time I met Max was that he called me and he said, "There's a bill that's being considered in the Senate and I can't get anybody to tell me what's in it because Frank Irwin is carrying it and nobody will tell me what's in that bill." Well, I was brand new. I had just been appointed commissioner, and I listened to Max for a while, and then I decided, well, I'm going to see if I can trust him. I'm going to trust him. So he said, "Let's meet downtown at the Piccadilly Cafe for breakfast and talk." So I told him what was in the bill, so he could use that for his purposes in the Senate. We both swore we'd never tell anybody this. But we both got old enough that we could tell them.
But don't tell anyone else. You know a great Margaret Thatcher story. I love this story. Would you tell folks about Margaret Thatcher's visit to San Angelo Estate?
I mentioned to a friend of mine, Phil Holcomb, who was a retired English professor from San Angelo, that I had refereed a debate between John Kenneth Galbraith and Bill Buckley, and he said, "Well, where were they?" And I said, "In Victoria, Texas." And he said, "Well, my guess is that their appearance in a town that size had something to do with money." And he said, "I suspect that's what brought Prime Minister Thatcher to San Angelo." So he said that he got the job of taking down on 3x5 cards the questions that the people in the audience wanted to submit. He said that he went through the questions, he held one out, he was holding it to the end. She answered, he said she was smooth, absolutely pat. She had been through so many speeches. She had the answer to every question, just came off beautifully. And then I asked her that last question, that there is a 13-year-old girl in our audience who would like for you to tell us what it was like when you were 13 years old during World War II. He said, "If looks could have killed me, I would not be here today." She looked at me and he said, she paused for a moment and then she gave the most beautiful, pleasant, charming response to what it was like to live in a house where some of the girls who were living with her had been sent from Europe and were being saved. That's the story.
Yeah. Political characters. One section, there's 7 sections in this book, each very interesting. One of them is among the learned, because you spend a fair amount of time among the learned. Tell us, by way of background, about your job as Texas Commissioner of Higher Education. Nearly 20 years, and that really means you have the responsibility for educating an entire generation of students.
don't hold me responsible.
Well, the parents had something to do with it, right? But lots of interesting players in higher education. Frank Irwin comes to mind. I wasn't so familiar with Frank Vanderbilt until I read your book. And I thought there were just a whole lot of interesting characters and stories that grew out of that experience. You were the first executive vice president of UT San Antonio at its founding. And tell us a little bit about that experience, getting a college up and running.
Well, the school had been authorized by the state legislature. The legislature would not provide land for any of the colleges, so land developers around the cities like San Antonio volunteered a piece of land. We hired an architect and got that design was going on, and then we started construction. But the chairman of the Board of Regents at that time, John Peace, said, "This is my university, and I want it to open while I'm still on the Board of Regents, not when the campus is complete." So we opened in temporary quarters in Coder Center. And we started, when we opened the doors the first day, we had 431 students in these facilities. One of the events that happened, ancillary to what else was going on, was that the young secretaries in our in the new school began to complain about this predator who was coming and trying to speaking. He'd carry in a book. He was a nice-looking young man, looked like a student. He would sit down, and then he'd proposition them and go into detail about what he wanted to do. So we got the police involved and everything. One day, they spent over a year trying to find out who it was, because it happened repeatedly. One day I was walking up the stairs, and I happened to look back down, and I saw this young woman that I wanted to have a second look at. And I looked down, and then I saw her face, and she had this absolute sudden shock on her face. I went to our police chief, and I said, "I think your man is downstairs." And he gave me this snide look like, "Look, the police and I have been trying to find this guy for over a year. Yeah, okay, I'll go down." He came back that afternoon and said, "How did you know that was the guy?" He was a truck driver, and he said that he had decided that would be a nice place a university would be a nice place, so he was in periodically and everything. Well, I won't say the rest of the story, but anyway, that was an experience, hiring faculty, putting together catalog degree programs that were going to offer, getting the buildings completed. That was very challenging.
Interesting period of your life. Many interesting times in your life covered in this. If you have a chance, I encourage you to get a copy of the book and meet some of the interesting characters that Ken introduces us to and the stories he has to tell. As you know, there's some signed copies available in the back, and we also have refreshments. I'm curious to know if any of you have questions for Ken. Okay, Mr. Oslick.
I'd just love for you to tell the story about Preston making some remarks at a governor's convention. It breaks me up every time I read it and hear it.
Well, Preston Smith, after he'd been out of the governor's job for a while, got invited to a special dinner for recognition, and he thought he was there for decoration with the other past governors, and he said just as he bit into his dessert, just as he bit into his dessert, the MC announced that each of the governors was going to be asked to say a few words, and he said, "I didn't have anything prepared." These other governors got up and started speaking, and finally it was my turn, and he said, I stood up and I said, "It was a cold and windy day, on the Panhandle when I decided to go bird hunting. The dogs were scratching the paint off the door when they saw me putting on my hunting boots. And we went out and we got in my car and we drove out to my hunting place and let the dogs out and they're baying and running. And I go and pop the trunk open and I'd forgotten my shotgun. So I got on my CB radio and I called my wife and I said, I'm out at our lease. I need my shotgun. Can you bring it to me? And she said, Preston, you're breaking up. I can't hear what you're saying. Can you say that again? He said, I'm out at the lease. I need my shotgun. Can you bring me my gun? She said, you're coming through now. I've almost got it. Say it one more time. And he said, bring me my gun. G as in Jesus. U as in Europe. And N in pneumonia. Bring me my gun. I asked Preston one time if he met a lot of other governors, and he said, oh yeah. He said, but one of them's crazy. He said, Earl Long, he's next door in Louisiana. That guy's nuts. He said, one time I asked a bellhop in El Paso if he ever carried bags for other governors, and he said, oh yeah, I carried them for Earl Long. He had the heaviest suitcases I ever carried in my life. And when we got up to his room, we opened them, they were full of watermelons. Well, I exchanged stories with my counterpart in Louisiana, Bill Arsenault, and he would tell me stories about Earl Long. He said one day at Earl Long, he was having a press conference, making all the promises and taking credit for what he'd accomplished, running for re-election, and his nun stood up at the back. She was a newspaper reporter for a Catholic newspaper, and she said, Governor, we hear all these stories about you drinking and gambling and carousing at night, and we hear that you're going over to Texas and seeing this woman called Candy Barr. Now, we want to know how you can run for re-election when you're doing things like that. And all the press, oh my gosh, they all knew these stories. Nobody dared to ask him. Mom leaned over the podium, looked contrite, and said, pray for me, sister.
That's wonderful, Ken. John tells me that all the books are sold out, but more are on order. So, and I bet Ken will sign those when they come in. So, if you didn't get a book today, there'll soon be some more here at Westminster. You can, they can maybe send you an email and let you know.
Maybe we can make a list of people who want to copy.
We could do that. We could make a list.
Yeah, I've got one more question. The picture on the back of the book with you and Johnson. Well, what's about that picture?
Well, there's a picture LBJ was taken talking to Fortas, and you may remember he was leaning over Fortas, and Fortas was leaning back. Well, down at the Zachary Scott Theater, one of their fundraisers, they had a picture of LBJ leaning without Fortas. So I went over and took Fortas's posture. And Emily took a picture, and when I sent it in to the person putting the book together, I said, dare we use this as the author's photograph? And they printed it.
Are there any other questions? Okay, well, thank you, Ken.
And thank you.